and welcome to another edition of Synoptic Gospels with Life Pacific University Online. Today we are going to start the first part of a series this week on the Sermon on the Mount. This week will be focused primarily on thinking through the ethics of Jesus, the ethics presented in the Sermon on the Mount, and the following lecture will focus more on the content and structure of the Sermon on the Mount. The content in this lecture, in the interest of citing my sources, is primarily based on Scott McKnight's work, which is present in the Story of the Bible commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, in the introduction to that commentary. And also you can find this in the Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels in McKnight's article called The Ethics of Jesus. And you can actually access that as a student through the library online if you're interested in reading it. So what we're concerned with here in the ethics of Jesus is how Jews and then later Gentiles followed Jesus in his own praxis of Torah observance, also with his articulation of the premier revelation of God's will in Israel's Torah, and how to embody his moral teachings in ways that manifest the kingdom of God. In particular, the Sermon on the Mount has become the locus classicus in interpreting the ethics of Jesus, meaning that it's pretty much the central passage for Jesus' ethical teaching. And when we refer to the Sermon on the Mount, there are two sermons. There's one in Luke and one in Matthew. One in Luke is usually referred to as the Sermon on the Plain. We typically mean the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, but there are two occurrences of the sermon that are very similar in true synoptic fashion. Jesus' ethics or ethical theory can also be fruitfully compared with some classical ethical theories. So we're going to do that briefly, look at three main approaches to ethics and how they stand up to Jesus. And so in this lecture, we're going to cover Christian reinterpretations of Jesus' ethics, because we often are not comfortable with what Jesus is saying here in the Sermon on the Mount. And then, as I just said a moment ago, we're going to compare Jesus' approach to ethics with a few other prevailing ethical theories in the history of philosophy. And then we're going to finally focus on Jesus' ethics on their own. So to begin with, Christian reinterpretations of Jesus' ethics, some quotes here from McKnight that I found particularly helpful. And the first one, he's actually quoting another biblical scholar, but he says, "The history of the impact of the Sermon on the Mount can largely be described in terms of an attempt to domesticate everything in it that is shocking, demanding, and uncompromising, and render it harmless." And this is pretty accurate. We tend to read the Sermon on the Mount and think that it is extraordinary or something that we ought to, not hold people to, that sort of thing. This is pretty consistent throughout a lot of interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount. Again, a quote in the opening pages of McKnight's work from Dean Smith: "The Sermon on the Mount has a strange way of making us either better people or better liars." So either you follow the ethic or you find a way to make it sound like you follow the ethic. So there are four notable attempts that we can sum up for this on how we interpret the Sermon on the Mount. And the first, and this is probably the most common one, is that the Sermon on the Mount is really just Moses turned all the way up, and that Jesus is intending to use the law and to use this reinterpretation of the law as a mirror for sin. To show people how incredibly sinful they are. Another interpretation would be that it is Jesus trying to lay out some terms for private morality, that people would know how they ought to live their lives based on what he is saying. And then the third approach is that this is only for the elite Christian, that Jesus' high standards here in the sermon are only for the best of the best and the most committed, and people in monasteries and that sort of thing. And then finally, the fourth is that it's sort of like the second step or stage two, that there's something that Christians ought to understand, which is usually grace or justification, and then only after that can you look at the Sermon on the Mount and understand what Jesus is saying. So those who reinterpret the sermon, more often than not, they end up just denying the potency of the sermon, and sometimes simply turn elsewhere to Galatians or Romans or Ephesians. This is McKnight's observation. They turn to these other books for their Christian ethical instruction. What many such readings of the sermon really want is Paul, and since they can't find Paul in the sermon, they reinterpret the sermon and give us Paul instead. And this is somewhat common in Christianity. We are indebted to Paul disproportionately, and so we are often more shaped perhaps by Paul than we are by Jesus. And this is reflected in the way that we interpret the Sermon on the Mount. We often interpret it in light of Galatians, Romans, Ephesians, etc. We're reading Jesus through a Paul lens rather than Paul through a Jesus lens. And so this is fairly common. The Sermon on the Mount is the greatest moral document of all time. This is the center of Jesus' ethical teaching, and Jesus is arguably the most important ethical teacher in the history of the world. And so how does this fit into the history of ethical teaching? Well, there are three schools of thought that we'll cover in this lecture. One is Aristotle and his virtue ethics. The next is Emmanuel Kant and his categorical imperative, also sometimes called Deontological ethics. And then we will talk about Jeremy Bentham and Utilitarian ethics. Now we're going to talk about these very briefly. This isn't a course on ethics, and this isn't actually a lecture on ethics. It's a lecture on the ethics of the Sermon on the Mount. And so we're not going to go into these in huge detail, but it is helpful in framing the concepts for us so that we can kind of locate what Jesus is doing. So Aristotle, his virtue ethics rest on three concepts. The first one is this thing called Eudaimonia, which is literally to be good-spirited or well-spirited, and often understood to be human flourishing. So the goal of all life is human flourishing, or eudaimonia. Secondly, virtue only exists in the context of friendship. Thirdly, the practice of habits leads to virtue, not the other way around. So the question is not what should I do, but who should I be? How is this forming me, and who is it turning me into? Aristotle somewhat shockingly says that you can actually be accountable for a non-free decision if you have been forced into that decision by free decisions. So this would be like, for someone who is addicted to substances, that if you've made the free decision that has led you to that addiction, that now in your addiction, even if you aren't free, you are responsible for your prior free decision that has led you to this. And so this is Aristotle's perspective, that your decisions form you, even if they form you to the point where you are no longer free in your decisions, you are still responsible for your decisions. Now, Jesus' ethics bear a lot of similarities with this, but there are also some departures. So, for instance, Jesus doesn't teach the importance of habits as a way to form character. Jesus does emphasize the importance of context of friendship, though from his perspective it'd probably be more community than friendship. And so there are some similarities, but we do still have some differences. Immanuel Kant and his categorical imperative, or deontological ethics, deontological comes from the Greek word deon, which is ought, duty, or obligation. The categorical imperative is what is true for one must be true for all, and if we treat others as an end, and therefore value humanity inherently, we will act in such a way to live rationally and ethically. And this may sound somewhat like the golden rule to us, but there is a crucial difference here. The categorical imperative focuses more on what we should not do than on what we should do. And this calls to mind for me a passage in C.S. Lewis in The Weight of Glory, where he talks about the difficulty of switching from considering the highest virtue as love to considering the highest virtue to be unselfishness. And he says what we've done here is we've exchanged a good thing for the absence of a bad thing, right? And we can even see this in our culture today. If I say that I'm a faithful spouse, Generally, in most contexts, that means that I've just successfully not cheated on my wife. It doesn't mean that I'm actually a good husband. It just means that I've not cheated, right? And so instead of there being the presence of a virtue, there's the absence of a vice. And so that's what we're talking about here, okay? And then finally, with Jeremy Bentham and Utilitarian Ethics. Utilitarian Ethics is comprised of at least two and usually three things. It's consequentialist, it's universalist, and it is usually hedonist. This means that an action is right if and only if it produces, consequentialist, the greatest good, hedonism, for the greatest number, universalist. And this is a source for the ethical approach that says, as long as I'm not hurting anybody. This is utilitarianism. There's some merit to this approach as well, and some similarity with Jesus' teaching. But however, utilitarian ethics are often disproportionately shaped by those in power to the disadvantage of everyone else. And so this doesn't work perfectly for us. So what do we do with Jesus' ethics in contrast to these? Jesus doesn't fit into any of these theories, and the Sermon on the Mount requires a better theory that encapsulates what's going on there. There's something about the Sermon on the Mount that makes Christians nervous, and in particular makes Protestants nervous, especially those whose theology's first foot is a special understanding of grace. And why is this? It's because Jesus doesn't do ethics the way that we want him to. You can squeeze some texts all you want, but Jesus just doesn't say first grace, then obedience. So, what are we to do with this? Again, this is all coming from McKnight. McKnight's a wonderful New Testament scholar. If you're curious, I highly recommend his work, though obviously I disagree with him on some things, which is the case with everyone, right? And so his approach in response to this is to view Jesus' ethics through four angles. And he calls them ethics from above, ethics from beyond, ethics from below, and then ethics that are shaped by a pneumatic messianic community. So what do we mean by ethics from above? Well, from above indicates that the ethical system in question is divine in origin. Everything about Jesus' ethics emerges from the history of God having spoken directly to Israel. And if we notice, Jesus never says, "Thus saith the Lord," like an Old Testament prophet would. He speaks directly as the voice of God. Classic virtue, Kantian, and utilitarian ethics never make the claim to be divinely revealed words, but this is the heart of the ethic of Jesus. So we have a radical difference here from the other three views. So recent ethical theories like divine command theory and narrative ethics fit into this category of ethics from above, that God himself has been involved in communicating to us how we ought to live, what we ought to do. Ethics from beyond indicates that the ethical system in question is focused on the future. So we can see in Jesus that his ethical posture towards the present is robustly shaped by a certain knowledge of God's future. Sermon on the Mount is the reality of the new age made possible in time. The future has already begun to take effect in the present. And McKnight says this, which I found very challenging, that an ethic unshaped by eschatology is neither Jesus nor Christian. Eschatology is the study of the last things. And if your approach to right and wrong pays no mind whatsoever to the future, and especially the consummation of all things, then that approach to right and wrong is neither the approach taken by Jesus, nor is it a Christian approach. And I'm not completely convinced that I agree with McKnight here, but man, that is a challenging thought. Eschatology often gets relegated to these esoteric discussions that no one really wants to participate in, except for a select few. And so eschatology often is not brought to bear on other topics. And I think it is very relevant to us in our regular life. But McKnight is making a really strong claim here that really is worthy of consideration. Are our ethics shaped by the way that we think the future will play out? It's huge. Ethics from below indicates that the ethical system in question is human in origin. And I have a typo there. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a typo. It says from beyond there on that first point. Should be from below. And so we have ethics from above, ethics from beyond, and now ethics from below. And this means that we have the ethics originating from humans. And this is wisdom literature. And so McKnight tells us, wisdom writers don't say God says do this. This would be divine command theory. Neither do they say, here comes God, better shape up. This is ethics from beyond, or perhaps even from above, or a mixture of the two. Now, the wisdom tradition anchors itself in human observation. Wisdom, then, is how to live in God's world, in God's way. But this kind of wisdom can only be acquired by those who are humbly receptive to the wisdom of society's sages. This is the wisdom tradition of the Old Testament. This is what we get in Job. This is what we get in Proverbs. This is what we get in Ecclesiastes. This is what we get in some of the Psalms even. Wisdom literature that's, hard won, hard fought. Here's how life works, and here's how you ought to live. Here's how you ought to behave. And so this is one of the elements of Jesus' ethics. And then we have this pneumatic messianic community. Pneumatic messianic community refers to three specific dimensions that are inaugurated in Jesus' ministry. And they are pneumatic, the people of God have received the Spirit of God. Pneumatos is the Greek word for spirit, and pneumatic is just an English version of that, meaning spiritual or something along those lines. Messianic, the people of God have been provided a relationship with him through the Messiah. Then community, both of the previous elements create a new and unique community that provides the context in which his ethic can be lived out. Those three elements for his ethics are tied to his messianic vocation, his conviction that an ethic can only be lived out in community and through the power of the Spirit now at work. I find this really interesting because I also teach some classes on world religions, and there is a version of Buddhism that has what's called the three jewels. And the three jewels are I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, and I take refuge in the Sangha. And Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha are the Buddha himself, the teaching of the Buddha, and then the community of the Buddha. And it's interesting how that connects here, and that how you can kind of see that as something that, if you're ministering to somebody who believes that there's some connections that you can make there, right? Some similarities there. Now, I'm not one to affirm that, all world religions are true, but I do think that, all truth is God's truth. And so other religions do have some things in them that are, whispers of the divine. And so God has not left himself without a witness. Now, in conclusion, what is Jesus's ethic? Well, the sermon isn't just about how to behave. It's about discovering the living God in the loving and dying Jesus and learning to reflect that love ourselves into a world that needs it badly. Jesus doesn't offer abstract principles or simply his version of the Torah for a new society. And if you remember from the lecture in Matthew, he is offering his own version of the Torah to some degree. But that's not all he's doing. Instead, he offers himself to his disciples. Or put differently, he summons them to himself, and in participation with Jesus and his vision, the disciples are transformed into the fullness of the kingdom moral vision. The sermon, therefore, is not a list of requirements, but rather a description of the life of a people gathered by and around Jesus. This is really transformative, because thinking about ethics in terms of union to Christ, participation in Christ, is really different. If this is something that you're interested in, I'd recommend the works of Michael Gorman, and also my graduate supervisor, Donald Fairbairn, Life in the Trinity. Wrote Life in the Trinity. Is phenomenal work on this. This idea of communion with God and participation in God. That ethic is not simply this move towards God. You think about the Ten Commandments. We often think of the law as legalistic when it's not. And if you look at the preamble to the Ten Commandments, those of you that took practicum with me would know this, that the opening to the Ten Commandments is, I'm the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of oppressive slavery. So God isn't starting with expectations. God's starting with his deliverance and then inviting us into expectations. And so, likewise here with the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is drawing us into this relationship, right? In the same way that God delivered the people from Israel and then communicated with them expectations, Jesus is drawing us into this relationship. And in the context of that relationship, here's what life should look like. And that really changes things. So I hope this has impacted you. I hope as you read the Sermon on the Mount, I hope as you work on the Sermon on the Mount worksheet, that this really does change you, and that, to work off of the initial quote in the lecture, that it wouldn't make you a better liar, but that it would make you a better person. And I just pray, Lord, that you would do this for your people, that they would be better people, that they would be closer to you, they would better reflect you to the people around them. God, for the sake of your name, for the sake of your kingdom, for the sake of your glory. In Jesus' name.